Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. On the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continent and looking at the history and current affairs of each nation. We now explore the West African country of Ivory Coast, which, funnily or interestingly enough, its flag looks like the Irish flag. But anywho, who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our returning champion, the brilliant historian and journalist and anti-imperialist activist Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire, and also a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports, who will be our guide on this trip to Ivory Coast's history and current affairs. So, Abayomi, welcome back to the program as always.
It's always very, very challenging and pleasurable to review the history and contemporary affairs of all these African states. Cote d'Ivoire is very interesting from a historical standpoint, but also in regard to the modern politics of Africa, which is unfolding as we speak.
Well, that's why we have you on, Abayomi, and it's always an honor to have you, and real privilege to have you as our as our history teacher and our
Okay.
tourist guide. So, all my thanks and appreciation for the time you give us.
Yeah.
And as always, folks, please help One Plus One by sharing widely our content. Last weekend was a very good weekend. Facebook actually allowed me to share my content widely. But that being said, folks, that can always change within 3 days or even a couple of hours. So Facebook is still limiting how much I can share and post. So please share widely. One plus one across your social media and emails. And as always, folks, please donate generously to Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. And please donate generously if you can to One Plus One. And again, share all of our content, past and present. Help us overcome the far right algorithms. Help us overcome the monopoly Western corporate media and state media has in the social media world by sharing, again, One Plus One's content and again, donating to us. And now on to the topic at hand. So, Abayomi, as always, tell us, what was Ivory Coast like before French colonization? And when France colonized Ivory Coast, what were the conditions like for the people?
Just like other states that we've discussed, we have to look at Cote d'Ivoire within a broader context than what it became under French colonialism and the modern neo-colonial independence structures. And a lot of the peoples and civilizations expanded far beyond what today is designated as nation states. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, there were development of kingdoms and civilizations in the area that is now known as Ivory Coast. And these kingdoms were much broader than what modern day Ivory Coast, what it exists today in modern day times. So we had the development of Akan civilizations and cultures, the Yeman, the Begbo. There was also the Brong civilizations, which extended from Cote d'Ivoire into Ghana. Also, there were Mandi speaking Islamic centers of both trade and civilization, which existed in the region. These peoples were involved in trade that extended far beyond the areas that are today considered Ivory Coast and Ghana and Upper Volta, which later became Burkina Faso, all the way into Mali, and even past the further north than the Sahara. So African people historically have been involved in trade and interchange of cultures and knowledge far beyond the areas which today are designated as their nation states. And this is definitely true in regard to Cote d'Ivoire. There was metallurgy development. People developed iron technology, which was used to produce weapons, agricultural implements, and also blacksmithing was widespread in the area. They created all types of goods, arrowheads, knives, rings, blades, spurs, Bronze later became a principal area of production and trade as well. You also had agricultural production. People produced yams, carrots, onions, sorghum, and millet. Then you had animal husbandry, which resulted in the production of cows, sheep, goats. So yes, these peoples were involved heavily in production, whether it's metallurgy, bronze, agricultural production, animal husbandry. You had the development of the Kong Empire, which we had talked about in earlier programs that developed between the uh, 18th and the 19th centuries. Then there was the Ouattara Empire that was headed by a man named Sekou Ouattara. They developed high civilizations, which included housing settlements. There was also production centers for agricultural products that existed outside these housing settlements. Then city-states arose in the region as well. So yes, this illustrates that the whole notion that there was nothing really going on, that development had been arrested or was non-existent in Africa. These recent discoveries, whether it's through documents or archaeological digs or oral history, illustrates that Africa was producing goods involved in trade, and at the same time consolidating through various methods larger nation states and city states, whether it was by force or whether it was through voluntary means. This was a situation that was developing prior to the intervention of Western European countries. Now, Portugal is designated as the first country to make contact with the peoples of Cote d'Ivoire. And this took place during the late 15th century. They were involved in trade. They made arrangements with local traditional leaders to set up trading installations along the West African coast, including Cote d'Ivoire. Then later, the area was divided in terms of categories by the Western European colonialists. You had the Slave Coast, there was the Gold Coast, there was the Pepper Coast, and then there was the Ivory Coast. The Ivory Coast was designated that because they wanted ivory to export to Europe. But soon enough, the supply of ivory dried up, but still they kept the same name. And that name was actually given to the Ivory Coast by the Portuguese. This is long before the intervention of the French.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the Ouattara kingdom became very, very strong during the 19th century. However, due to the pressure by the French colonialists, they began to succumb to this pressure, both military as well as economic. And they made arrangements with the French to allow them to further penetrate areas in West Africa. And this brought them into direct conflict with other groups, particularly the group that was headed by Samori Touré, which Samori Touré was a very, very adamant anti-colonialist fighter. And he actually eventually took over the Ouattara kingdom because of their capitulation to French colonialism. And he fought gallantly against the intervention of the French for several years. Later, he was captured and exiled to the Seychelles. So yes, there's a history of economic and cultural development along with the struggle against colonialism.
Tell us a bit more. What were the conditions like of the people when France colonized Ivory Coast?
The people were made subjects of French colonialism. They were considered vassals in terms of labor towards Paris. And later on, they developed a different system, which was more related to the assimilation of people. But even though there was an emphasis on assimilation, it had to be within the confines of French culture and the French political system. So by the period of World War I, they recruited Africans into the French military during the First Imperialist War. And this continued to the Second Imperialist War, where Africans were also recruited to fight on behalf of France against their enemies. The Senegal Rifles, this was a African unit that was trained by the French, and they fought alongside France, particularly Free France, during the Second World War. Nonetheless, there was a huge massacre of them in 1944, which was covered up for decades. And it's just recently that the French government acknowledged this massacre, which occurred in 1944. And the filmmaker Simben Usman.
Abayomi. Firstly, why? So why was there? Why was there a massacre of these soldiers that were serving the French Empire?
Well, what happened was that a lot of them were captured under the Vichy French government. And after their capture, they were tortured by the Nazis. A number of them died and suffered in internment camps. And then when they were released, they demanded some compensation for their suffering and also compensation for their role in the French military. So they held a silent demonstration, and they were fired upon by the French colonial authorities. And many people died. The French first said that this massacre never occurred. Then later they said, well, there was some shooting, there was some unrest, but only a few people died. But eventually it came out clearly that a number of people had been massacred by the French colonial authorities. Simben Usman, who is he's a late now, but he was a Senegalese filmmaker, a Marxist, actually did a film on this incident. And it was shown here in the United States many, many years ago.
Wow.
So yeah, this is well documented. But Simben is a phenomenal figure. His films really capture the character of French colonialism and its impact on the African people. And he was somewhat tolerated in Senegal, but at the same time, his films really exposed colonialism and the need to fight against neocolonialism in Africa. So in Cote d'Ivoire, during World War II, of course, the system shifted. After the Conference of Free France in 1944 in Brazzaville, in the Republic, what is today the Republic of Congo, and we've discussed this before, they came up with a new system to attempt to further integrate Africans into the French political construct. And more people were allowed to run for office and set up their own indirect governing systems. But at the same time, some actually went to Europe to serve in the French National Assembly. Yet this was not enough to stop the resistance to French colonialism. Now, the French around during the 1830s and 1840s, they made a concerted effort to seize complete control of territories in West Africa. But it took them decades to complete this. And of course, I mentioned before the efforts of Samori Touré during the 1890s. And then after that, even after they defeated him and other resistance fighters, they still were having problems because they imposed forced labor and taxation on the people. So people resisted that. So they had to put down several rebellions during the early part of the 20th century to further subdue the African people, which was done during the period of World War I. So yes, it was resistance, and at the same time, there was exploitation of the African people in West Africa in those territories that were controlled by French colonialism.
Very quickly, the taxation that the French imposed on their colonial subjects, I assume very regressive, given that a majority of people were poor, exploited, and forced labor on top of that.
Yes, that's why they had to go to work in order to pay taxes, in order to have a place to live, in order to eat, because the process was totally controlled by French imperialism.
Even
And what was the
though,
reason why?
even though, even though most of the French colonial subjects were living in destitute, poor conditions.
Yeah, they still had to pay taxes. Yeah. And this was common all over the continent, even in East Africa. This was a result of the Maji Maji revolt in the early part of the 20th century in Tanganyika, which then was controlled by the Germans. The fact that they took away the agricultural production by the African people and forced them to work in these plantations. But this happened all over the continent. In West Africa, in Togo and Cameroon, we spoke about this before, where the Germans colonized those areas in conjunction with the French and the British. And they were forced too into these labor camps and had taxes imposed upon them, not for their benefit, but for the benefit of the European colonial powers.
Crazy. That's just
That's
mind-boggling.
colonialism,
Mind-boggling the crimes against
imperialism,
humanity.
yes.
Well,
But
that's
the
a perfect.
country was very rich in terms of agricultural production. And they were also heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade along the West African coast. Ivory Coast was not as deeply affected, but it was to an extent that you have people today, even in the United States, who can trace their ancestry back to Ivory Coast. But in comparison to other areas like Ghana and Nigeria and Benin, it was not as heavily impacted uh, in regard to Ivory Coast as it was in other areas of West Africa. But yes, this is a very exploitative system, and it was backed up by the French military, who sent their forces in there to put down rebellions, to overthrow and kill and capture those African leaders and traditional societies which refused to go along with their process. And those that did were also subjected to rebellions from below and also attacks from other traditional societies which were opposed to the French colonial system.
Perfect segue to this question. How did Ivory Coast become independent? Was the peaceful transition or one of violent struggle? And then tell us about the nation's 2 decades under the leadership of, oh, wow, he's got one of those complicated French names. Under the
Felix
leadership of,
Houphouët-Boignyand. Felix
exactly.
Houphouët-Boignyand was a
Thank you,
central
exactly.
figure.
Who ruled from November the 3rd, 1960 to December 6th, 1993. He and his right wing, or dare I say, far right party, the Democratic Party of Ivory Coast, African Democratic Rally. How do you assess his legacy when we talk socio-economic specifically for the vast majority of the people of Ivory Coast? Very curious your response. Oh, and also, just before you answer that, he actually served in the French National Assembly. He
Yes,
actually was part of a broad church of Pan-Africanist, African nationalist, anti-colonialist movement. So that itself is very interesting. But anyways, your response before we yeah, your response.
to a large degree, he was groomed for that position. He was involved in ostensibly organizing cocoa production workers. Ivory Coast became a large source of cocoa production. And even today, it is said that they are the largest producers of cocoa internationally. And during the 1950s, he was groomed in regard to being a part of the French colonial governance construct. He became a, quote, minister, unquote, one of the few ministers in the French colonial government during the 1950s. In 1956, when the Loy cadre system was developed under Charles de Gaulle, he was very much a part of that and a proponent of it. And then in 1958, of course, they developed the indirect system of rule, um, local self-rule, but still under the dominance of Paris. And then in 1960, as part of the wave of the African independence movement, they were awarded independence, but they maintained close ties with the French colonial system. And Felix Houphouët-Boignyand is noted as someone who actually fostered the development of neocolonialism in West Africa. His party was very closely allied with France. They encouraged even more repatriation by French nationals into Cote d'Ivoire. In fact, the number of French living in Cote d'Ivoire accelerated after their independence in 1960. They were utilized as teachers, as technicians, as military advisors, etc. And they dumped a lot of financial resources into the country over a period of about 30 years between 1960 and 1990. The country became a showpiece for modern day neocolonialism in West Africa. In comparison to countries such as Guinea-Conakry, which had rejected the system of indirect rule by France in 1958, they voted against the referendum that was put forward by de Gaulle. They opted for independence. I believe the election was on September 28th, and they voted it down. And then on October 2nd, they declared their national independence. But in doing that, in Conakry, under the Democratic Party of Guinea, which had a different political line than the Democratic Party of Ivory Coast, the French withdrew all their technicians. They ripped telephone lines out of the wall and just left the country abandoned in poverty. And it was only Dr. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, which put forward a 10 million pound loan to Guinea under Secretary Ray, which was able to sustain the country from complete collapse. But yes, Ivory Coast was a highlighted area for neocolonialism in Africa. They built buildings, they built infrastructure there, and there was money for an elite to engage in conspicuous consumption. And it was used as a counterpoint to what was going on in Guinea and in other countries around the African continent, saying, in essence, that independent Africa, in order for it to succeed, had to be done within the context of European colonial and neocolonial dominance. And that was done, and it seemed to have worked for a number of years, up until the 1980s, when it started to collapse. When you had the formation of the Popular Front under Laurent Gbagbo, which caused him to be forced into exile. And later, of course, which we'll get to a little bit later on in the interview, became a subject of not only the French neocolonial authorities, but also the International Criminal Court. But yes, was the situation there between the 1960s and the 1980s. And Houphouët-Boignyand was attempting to create a new Ivorian nation. He called for the formation of a new capital outside of Abidjan called Yamoussoukro. And that is the capital today. There's a lot of money invested in building this new city, which attributed to the financial problems that developed during the 1980s and 1990s, which triggered unrest inside the country.
And again, give people an idea of how right wing this government was on because on Wikipedia, while they build themselves, while this party and President Felix build themselves on the French old school right wing model of Gaullism and the policies of de Gaulle, Pompidou, Gistain, and Jacques Chirac, who weren't flaming, fire breathing right wingers, at least not domestically, like much of the American, Australian, New Zealand, and British right wingers. But still, this party, though it hides behind, this party of President Felix, though it hides behind policies like planned liberalism and state capitalism, at its core is fiscal conservatism and economic liberalism. Not much difference between, the market is God, let big business thrive, laissez-faire, which in the African context, a continent underdeveloped because of colonialism, having policies like that do not address the plight of the majority poor, many living in destitute levels of poverty. And President Felix and his Democratic Party of Ivory Coast African Democratic Rally, they are members of the International Democracy Union and its African regional branch, Democracy Union of Africa. This is when the global center to far right meet up to see how they can advance their hideous right wing agenda and how they can help one another out to win and unify the right. And with that said, talk about President Felix's relations with France during the Cold War and that of other capitalist imperialist nations like the US, Britain, and Canada and Israel, and then its relations with the USSR and the communist bloc of nations like Eastern Europe, Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea. Very curious response.
Yeah, they maintained very close ties economically and politically and even culturally with the former French colonial system. Then, after the ascendancy of President John F. Kennedy in the United States, who won the election in 1960 by a very narrow margin. But when Kennedy was in the Senate in the late 1950s, he was the first to develop a Senate committee on Africa. Now, they didn't do this out of the kindness of their hearts. What they were doing was positioning themselves after independence to come in and exert U.S. influence over the newly independent African states. And we saw this in regard to Cote d'Ivoire. In 1962, Felix Houphouët-Boignyand was invited on a state visit to the United States where he met with President Kennedy. So the same situation developed. They attempted to do the same thing in Algeria. Now, Algeria, they fought a war of liberation between 1954 and 1962 when the French colonial system collapsed there under de Gaulle, and the U.S. Made overtures to the FLN to try to establish some type of partnership with them in the absence of French colonial rule. But that was only done in an effort to maintain their reliance on Western imperialist economic resources and structures. And it was an interesting story. In 1962, when Ben Bella visited the United States, he met with people in the Kennedy administration. And after he was supposed to go to Cuba after he visited the United States. And people in the Kennedy administration advised him not to go to Cuba because there was a plot to down his airplane en route to Cuba by anti-Castro Cubans who, in fact, were funded and coordinated and promoted by the Central Intelligence Agency. But, he disregarded this. But this is a very, very important story because they told Ben Bella not to go to Cuba because he could be killed, by anti-Castro Cubans who were in the pay of U.S. imperialism. So this draws a distinction between countries like Guinea, which was a former French colony, Algeria, which was a former French colony, and Mali. You had close ties between Mali, Guinea, and Ghana. They formed a union in 1960 after Mali became independent under Modibo Keita. But yes, they maintain very, very close ties under French neocolonialism in Cote d'Ivoire. You had French troops, French military advisors, French technicians, and heavy French influence continued inside Cote d'Ivoire for many years during the post-independence period.
And talk about Ivory Coast after President Felix steps down. And his right-wing party continues to govern under the leadership of Henry Konan Bedi. Talk about his legacy. He ruled from December the 3rd, 1993 to December 27, 1999. And then talk to us about when Ivory Coast found itself under military rule and the leadership of Robert Gui, apologies if I'm butchering his name, from December the 24th, 1999 to October 26th, 2000. How do you assess his legacy? But first, talk to us about Badi, and then talk to us about Robert Gui.
Yes, Henri Konan Bedaya succeeded Felix Houphouët-Boignyand, who became second and died during the early 1990s. He continued the same process of neocolonialism and was not able to stave off a financial collapse during the early 1990s when the CFA franc zone ran into extreme difficulties. There was also a broad continental movement towards multi-party democracy in Africa during the early 1990s, and that impacted Ivory Coast as well. As I mentioned earlier, Laurent Gbagbo established what was known as the Popular Front, the Ivory Coast Popular Front, and he was driven out of the country during that time period. Now, Gbagbo was considered a socialist. He was considered a left-wing leader, and there was really no room for him within the Ivory Coast political system. Things deteriorated,
Even and this is funny because he still had the socialist government of Francois Mitterrand, power sharing with Jacques Chirac's center right party. I thought it would be interesting just to add all that in. But yeah, continue with what you're saying. Sorry.
Yes. So yeah, all these developments were going on during the early 1990s, and eventually there was a military coup that occurred inside the country when there were mass demonstrations. But Badayi, one thing that distinguished him from Felix Houphouët-Boignyand was that he emphasized regional as well as tribal differences. And this caused a lot of problems. It eventually led to a civil war inside the country, where the people in the South were considered more authentic in regard to their Ivorian roots than people in other regions of the country. So they came up with this concept of Avoirité, which tried to alienate other groupings inside the country. Now, Ivory Coast was a multi-religious state. It was heavily Christian. In fact, they built a huge Catholic church there. It was absolutely astonishing. But at the same time, you still have Islamic people in the country, as well as those who still practice traditional African religions. So as the situation deteriorated, there was a military coup d'etat, and this eventually led to a civil war inside the country.
Yeah.
So you can only imagine this by the late 1990s, early 2000s. The country had gone from being a showpiece for neocolonialism in Africa, where there was a tremendous amount of investment being turned over from France and other parts of the capitalist world into Cote d'Ivoire, to a state that was falling apart at the seams, where the poverty became exposed, where you had the advent of regionalism to the point of the outbreak of civil war. So it was a big shift over this period between 1960 up until around 2000.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you've already told us about the first Ivory Coast about the first Ivory Coast Civil War. Don't forget to talk to us more about the second Ivory Coast Civil War later. But what you just said is fascinating. So under President Felix, a right winger, but he didn't have the fiscal. He didn't have the social reactionary conservatism because he didn't believe in tribalism. But then his successor actually engages in capitalist tribalism, leading to
yes, greater divisions, demonstrations, and eventually outbreak of armed conflict that was largely centered around regional differences in the country.
Wow, that's okay. So that's fascinating. Okay, so and so you've already so talk to us then about the leadership of Laurent uh Gbagbo and what led to his coup and the following civil war following his ouster. And interesting, President Laurent, uh, his party, the center left Ivorian Popular Front, is described as democratic socialist to social democracy party. And like the Ivory Coast right wingers, they're inspired by the French, who are inspired by the French right wing slash liberals. The Ivorian Popular Front is heavily influenced by the French Socialist Party, the once mighty French Socialist Party, who during the 1980s and early 90s was led by Francois Mitterrand, who did share power with the right leaning President Jacques Chirac, or Prime Minister Jacques Chirac at the time, and who, when he was president, the prime minister was a socialist, Lionel Jospin. And the Ivorian Popular Front, their members up to 2011, they were members of Socialist International, and this is where the center left parties globally would meet up to advance a socialist agenda. But the problem with that organization and its sister one, Progressive Alliance, is that it's dominated by Western European and Nordic social democratic parties who always had a strong imperialist streak, social imperialist streak. And by the 1980s and certainly by the 90s, they had pivoted more and more to the economic rights, often clashing with their Latin American and African and other global South developing world members. So I'm very curious your response, Abayomi, to the legacy of President Laurent and explain what happened with his ouster.
Yes, well, in France itself, due to the burgeoning economic crisis within the capitalist system, they began to retreat on many of the advances that have been won by the labor movement inside of France. And as a result of that, there were widespread demonstrations and unrest, even during the 1980s in France. And we've seen it even more so in the last several years there. And we could talk about that later as well. Even recently, with the budget crisis and the collapse of the latest French government. And I think this is the fourth prime minister in France over the last 2 years. Nonetheless, the economic crisis continued in Cote d'Ivoire. And in 2010, there were national elections, which many people say Laurent Gbagbo won. Alassane Ouattara, who represents the right wing legacy in Ivorian politics, was supported by Paris under Nicolas Sarkozy, who was president during that time period. So there were clashes that took place in the street, armed conflict, and there was no resolution to the situation. Gbagbo was driven out of the official residences that he had occupied. And then he had taken refuge in a hotel inside of Ivory Coast, which was stormed by French paratroopers. He was arrested and taken to the Netherlands and put on trial by the International Criminal Court. His wife, Simone Gbagbo, who was a political figure in her own right, was not deported from their own country, but she was imprisoned in Ivory Coast for a number of years. And there was an international campaign to support both of them by left-wing forces and Pan-Africanist forces throughout the international community. So Gbagbo was held there for a number of years in the Netherlands, and they put him on trial. It collapsed. They were not able to convict him of any crimes that he had been charged with.
Okay.
Then the ICC attempted to appeal his acquittal. So he went to Belgium. He was not allowed to return to Ivory Coast. And then when the appeal collapsed, he did go back to Ivory Coast. There was a campaign to release Simone Gbagbo, and eventually she was released as well. But when he went back, his party was suppressed. And even today, they're not allowed to operate freely. Now, Alassane Ouattara is pretty much a clear functionary of French neocolonialism. After they stormed the residence of Simone and Laurent Gbagbo, he was declared president. He was recognized by France as well as the United States under Barack Obama as the official head of state in Cote d'Ivoire. In order to shore up his administration, again, they poured in enormous amounts of capital from the West. So they can say, oh, look, under Ouattara, the nation is booming once again. Yet problems with the military arose and persisted. There were several mutinies inside of Ivory Coast, but it continued. So he had one term in office and a second term in office. And then, according to the Ivory Coast Constitution, he was supposed to relinquish power after 2 terms in office. They engineered the altering of the national constitution to allow him to run for a third term, in which he won. And now, after all that turmoil, after 3 terms in office, he's running again in a fourth term. And the elections are coming up later this year. A lot of the key opposition parties have been banned from participating. So it's really a very, very tense situation that's going on now inside of Ivory Coast. Simone, who is no longer, they're no longer together, Simone and Laurent Gbagbo, she has been cleared to run for political office just recently. We don't know how that's going to turn out, what political line she's going to take during the elections. This could be a tactic by Ouattara to divide the electorate, for the people who are cleared to run for political office. Laurent Gbagbo has been banned from running from political office, but he is still very active politically. In fact, back during July, he led mass demonstrations inside the country protesting the fourth candidacy of Alassane Ouattara. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding his candidacy, and there's a lot of opposition to him on a grassroots level and also on a political level inside the country.
Wow, fascinating and
Yeah, I'm
incredible,
sure.
and incredible how a lot of this doesn't get covered, and just incredible. I mean, I don't speak, French, so I can't scrutinize,
Mhm.
French corporate media and French state media, but I just bet you, if you were to watch, France 24 and other English language channels, which are funded by the French government, this completely gets suppressed. All the information that you just laid out for us, and just turning facts and completely inside out on its head. So since
Well,
President,
what you can do, even though you don't speak French, uh, Google Translation is improved considerably. So you can actually copy and paste text into Google Translation from English to French and get a pretty good idea about what's happening in the country. Um, like you said, the government,
but of course, one has to keep a very, very, critical eye and
exactly, because the French government is still, of course, supporting uh, what is going on in Cote d'Ivoire. Now, Emmanuel Macron, who is in a very precarious political situation right now in Paris, we have to be certain that they are pouring a tremendous amount of resources into Ivory Coast at this point. A lot of that is to counter what is going on in the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES, which is broken with the French and has also resigned, and they broke totally with the Economic Community of West African States, which the Ivory Coast is a part of. So they are going to support Alassane Ouattara because they see him as a bulwark against further anti-French sentiment and efforts to overturn pro-French governments in West Africa.
fascinating.
Also, another factor in
Yes.
Cote d'Ivoire is that they have discovered and they are exploiting oil as well. So you've had unrest under Alassane Ouattara among oil workers in Ivory Coast as well.
And since President Laurent's ouster, Ivory Coast, as you mentioned, has been under the leadership of Alassane Ouattara from 2010 up to the present day. For people who are curious, just a little bit more on his background. The guy worked at the IMF for several years or decades. Very neoliberal, far right, junk economic institution, and he was part of the dominant pro-French ruling right-wing party in Ivory Coast of former President Felix, the Democratic Party of Ivory Coast, the African Democratic Rally. Uh, the party he is a member of now that he leads, the Rally for the Republicans, believes in liberalism. And remind folks, when you believe in liberal democracy and you model your society based on that, the free market is central to that system, and that is not good for Africa, Latin America, or island nations, or any place that has been ravaged by colonialism or centuries of plutocracy. And his party is a member of Liberal International and its African regional branch of Africa, which is the Africa Liberal Network, and also is a member of centrist Democratic International. And both Liberal International and Centrist Democratic International. This organization is very similar to the International Democracy Union and Socialist International, except this is where liberals and centrists and big tent broad church progressives, although I find them all very right leaning, especially on social economics. And I say this because a lot of their members, whether they were in power through coalition governments or in opposition or in current affairs, if we talk about one of their Dutch members, have worked with the far right and their more regressive right wing cousins. The Liberal Party of Canada dominates this group. The MR of Belgium, the Reform Movement or Movement Reformateur is in this group. The FDP of Germany, Fianna Fáil of the Republic of Ireland, the Future Party of Lebanon, the Democratic Party of Luxembourg, the VVD of Holland, which is a hideous right-wing party if one follows Dutch politics the last several years or months. and again,
Yes,
and again, the many Nordic members and Eastern European members and the pan-European members are all part of right-leaning coalitions in the EU, like Renew Europe and the ALD, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe Party. And these are the ridiculous centrists and, again, right-leaning parties who, while socially liberal, are dogmatic when it comes to the free market. And they've made the EU into the neoliberal institution, which is only getting worse, and the EU Parliament into nothing more than a talk shop, and the EU into this boring, uninspiring, centrist windbag, both on domestic and on international bodies that is supportive of NATO and soft imperialism overseas, and centrist Democrat International, the French right-wing party of Nicolas Sarkozy. The Republicans are members of that organization. Fine Gael of Ireland, the Christian Democrats of Flanders, the CDU of Germany, Fidesz of Hungary, and the Kaitip Falang Party of Lebanon, and the PAN of Mexico, the National Action Party of Mexico, and the National Liberal Party of Romania, and the Social Democratic Party of Portugal, which is the right wing, despite its name. They are all members, of this, of these, organizations, and those who detest the EU. Again, Jose Barroso, was a member of the Social Democratic Party of Portugal, and for our for those involved in Venezuela solidarity, the Venezuelan far right party of Henry Capriles, Justice First, and the Christian Social Party COPE. Spain's dominant right wing party, the People's Party, are in this club. So Abayomi, sorry for getting a bit off track there, but again, tell us more how you. I just want to paint a picture of how right wing the current Party of Ivory Coast is. So again, talk a little bit more how you assess the governance of Ivory Coast under the current president Alassane Ouattara that you were talking about.
I think it's important that you mention that laundry list of political parties that Alassane Ouattara is aligned with. And we talk about liberalism, but it's really neoliberalism, which is pro-laissez-faire capitalism. We've seen it in France, how they have eroded the social contract of the country. They've changed the retirement system there, where people have to work more years in order to get full benefits. And there were huge demonstrations there a couple of years ago on this question. And periodically, you have outbreaks of strikes and rebellions throughout France in response to this. The recent collapse of the French government was due to an austerity budget they were trying to force through, which could not be done. Even the reforms in the pension system had to be done via executive measures, and they wouldn't even allow a vote in the French National Assembly on this question. So can we say these are really democratic systems, democratic forms of governance, when they are doing more and more to take away the rights of workers, and the level of racism that we see in France that's resulted in outbreaks of rebellions over the last 2 decades, really. So yes, these are the governments that they are allied with. These are the political parties that they're allied with. And that's why they're going to shore up Ouattara as much as they can. But it's going to be up to the people of Côte d'Ivoire, the workers, the poor people, the farmers, and even elements within the military, which are being exploited and abused as well, to determine the outcome of this election that's supposed to be coming up in October. They banned, left-wing parties, even pro-capitalist parties have been banned because they feel threatened that people may vote for these parties. And if that happens, that means that Ouattara and the whole French colonial system that is being imposed in West Africa will be in danger. So yes, this is a major problem. Even inside France itself, it's not clear what's going to happen because you have a large right-wing bloc as well.
Exactly.
The National Rally headed by Le Pen, even though she's been banned supposedly for running for office in the upcoming election due to corruption. However, at the same time, there are other forces in that party which could step up and actually challenge the party that's run by Macron and also the left bloc, which is substantial. In fact, the left coalition 2 years ago won the largest block of votes within the French National Assembly. Even though this happened, they were not able to have any influence on the appointment of who was going to be the prime minister who sets up the government in France.
And I can I can tell you, I argue with my parents a lot when it comes to French politics, and of course they have the upper hand because they're both fluent in French and stuff like that. But they watch and take at word a lot French corporate media and French state media, and they are not huge fans of the French guy, the far left winger.
Okay, Mélenchon.
Yes. They're very hostile to Mélenchon, and that is because French corporate media and French state media is very hostile to Mélenchon.
Yeah.
As hostile to him as they are of Marine Le Pen, even though the French far right gets enough space, and there are some newspapers that are very supportive of, if not her party specifically, certainly a lot of her ideas, and that of Eric, that of Eric Zemmour. So
and people have blocked, the left and the centrists to try to prevent the far right wing, which is really a neo-Nazi party, from taking over the executive branch of the French government. How long will that go on? Because we see the ascendancy of the right in several European countries. You got the AfD in Germany, the Alternatives for Deutschland. You have right-wing parties in the Netherlands. So in England, we see the rising support of Reform UK.
Actually, Abayomi, let me actually interrupt you right
Mm,
there because in the Netherlands, it's actually in the Netherlands, it's even worse. The
yeah.
VVD, the party I mentioned,
Mhm.
it's considered a center right party, and they are in they were in a coalition government with Hert Wilders' party, this other
Mhm.
pseudo fake farmer populist
Yes.
party, and this other right leaning party called the new social contract. So a center right to far right coalition, which has been a grossly incompetent government, and in fact, many of the right wing members of of that coalition have actually abandoned. And there are elections that are that are going to happen in October. But sadly, Hertz Wilders' party is actually still number one in the polls and so forth. So we don't know what's going to happen. But the reason why I mentioned that is because
Yes.
a country like the Netherlands, Spain, where the People's Party has actually, last two elections, they actually said that they don't mind working with the far right,
Hmm.
Vox, and so forth. And what you see also in Italy with the
Yes.
party of Berlusconi, I think,
Maloney.
a version of Forza Italy,
Yeah.
Forza Italy, so Berlusconi's party, working with the far right, like the League and Brothers of Italy. That's Giorgia Meloni's party. So
Yes.
the reason why I mention all of this is what is once upon a time these supposedly traditional center right parties would have never ever worked with the
Neo
far right.
Nazis.
They might have had factions, but they would have never ever worked with with the far right.
Hmm.
Now you're starting to see more and more of that, and that's why I always have to emphasize the International Democracy Union, because Stephen Harper, who is president or chairman of that party, his party, the Reform Party, and later Canadian Alliance, merged with the Progressive Conservatives to become the Conservative Party of Canada. And you,
Yes.
so once upon so again we I want people to just pay attention that more and more you're going to see center right merging with the far right or working in
Yes.
coalition or working in coalition there. And as you mentioned, in Britain,
Reform UK.
there are factions of the Conservative Party who want to work with Reform and think Reform, Nigel Farage's party, should actually just join the Conservative Party. That way the right could be more united and so forth. This is frightening. This is frightening stuff we're seeing. And in New Zealand, as we speak, the Kiwi, the New Zealand version of the Republican Party, of the Conservative Party, of the Liberal National Coalition in Australia, the National Party in New Zealand ha- is in a far right coalition government with New Zealand's first rabid far right party and this libertarian party, ACT Party. So again, folks, be afraid, be very afraid, and this is why the left needs to mobilize and find some way of uniting
Exactly.
because the far right is becoming the new normal and so forth. So
Exactly. And I think a lot of that has to do with the migration question, the crisis, which
exactly.
stems from the work of NATO and the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the whole international system of finance capital, which has disrupted African and Asian societies, fostering large scale migration across North Africa and West Asia into Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, and also into the UK. And in response to that, they have reacted in a very extreme right wing manner to ban or demonize migrants. And we see that going on in France, in the UK right now, even the Labour Party is running, trying to point out that they want to curb migration, to put migrants out of hotels in communities across the UK. So it's a very dangerous situation that is taking place. But the root of it is imperialism, because they have bombed countries like Libya, Iraq, Syria, and they have destabilized Afghanistan and other countries, either through direct military intervention or through the imposition of austerity programs through the IMF and the World Bank. So this is what's fueling this large-scale migration across the Mediterranean into Europe. So I put the onus of this crisis right back on the policies of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is headed by the United States in real time. Even though they have this guy who is from the Netherlands, who is supposed to be the Secretary General.
Mark Rutte and his party, the VVD, has even gone more to the right on both domestic and international politics, led by Dutch Turkish woman Dylan. Dylan, I can't pronounce her last name, but it starts with a Y. But yeah, and Rutte is the head of NATO right now, and when he left office, he left the country. Endless austerity, just endless austerity and so forth. So, yeah.
Yes, and he visited Donald Trump. Trump praised him, said he supported him as the Secretary General of NATO. So they have a very close relationship with the White House right now. These developments could lead to another international crisis in regard to the situation involving Ukraine. And they're fueling more support to the Zelensky regime in Kiev, which is losing the war against Russia and their special military operation in Ukraine. Trump wants to end this war, but he cannot, because if he withdraws U.S. support, that means that the Ukrainian government will collapse. And if that happens, he's going to be blamed for further weakening of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, although he claims he does not have unconditional support for, but in actuality he does. They've just released enormous amounts of weapons, long-range weapons, Patriot missiles to the Ukrainian regime. And he claims he's putting pressure on Zelensky.
And even amongst the right and
Yes.
the far right, there are very big, deep divisions when it comes to NATO. Just like you have a lot of far right douchebags, in the U.S. that want to stop the militarism overseas, so that the border can be much more militarized, and that the U.S. has endless, budgets for ICE and deporting illegals, but legal, but documented workers are always, even if your papers are in order, you still are going to be targeted. Nigel Farage, used to complain about EU migrants, which actually were legal, but England
Right.
always makes it much more strenuous to immigrate to the UK, and he's gone from just going after EU migration and illegals or undocumented people, as Carlito prefers, I says. He's gone from just attacking that to saying that that the UK needs to have net zero immigration, no legal people coming in, no undocumented people, of course, coming in, and that's Britain needs to get out of the European Court of Human Rights. So he's taking it to a whole nother far right level and even normalizing this, which was why Suella Braverman of the former, of the Rishi Sunak conservative government, she went to the United States and was talking to an audience there about how we need to rethink being a signatory to the international rights of refugees and so forth. So again, it's gone into crazy lands. The right wing into absolutely grotesque levels of xenophobia. I personally I don't give a shit how anybody gets into a country. I'm not bothered how people get into countries, legal or otherwise. But this is crazy. This is just crazy how the right wing have gone into this reactionary into these reactionary stuff, and you do see very bitter divisions amongst the right wing and the far right themselves, with some who are very supportive of NATO, but they still want détente with Russia, and others who just want endless wars and endless hostilities with Russia, not interested at all in détente with them, certainly not détente with China.
Well, the Trump wing of the right wing, there's an aspect of their strategy, and that is to break the alliance of BRICS by pulling Russia away from China in a close alliance with the United States. That has not worked. Has not worked at all. If you look at the ceremonies surrounding the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Japanese aggression, you had not only President Vladimir Putin of Russia, but also the Supreme Leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Kim Jong-un, and others. Even Modi of India was there. You had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, which
and
proceeded.
There's lots of right wingers, including Stephen Harper, who are trying to influence Modi to,
yes,
hey, come back into our sphere, come join our clubs, and be hostile towards Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, and so forth. So yeah,
yeah. So the problem in terms of even this scheme that Trump has to deport migrants to African states is collapsing. I just wrote an article on that earlier this week. It really doesn't amount to a whole lot. Only about 300 people. There's been an agreement to take them in, and even that is falling apart. Trump says he wants to deport 11 million people from the United States. Well, he has a long ways to go. If there are only approximately 300 people that have agreed to accept, and even at that, there's burgeoning opposition. The African Union has condemned this scheme. Even the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which has close ties with the United States, which has a conservative government, pro-capitalist government, has rejected taking migrants from the United States into the Federal Republic of Nigeria, saying that we will not be a dumping ground for criminal elements from the United States. And these elements, most of them are not criminals. They were there in the United States working for transnational corporations. And even the recent diplomatic row between Seoul, South Korea, the Republic of Korea, and the Trump administration, they raided a Hyundai LG batteries factory in Georgia that had workers there who had visas, special visas for skilled personnel to construct this production facility. And from recent reports, one of the MAGA activists in Georgia reported these people to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They raided the plant and arrested hundreds of people, put them in shackles, just like slaves. And they're still being held as of Wednesday. I don't know what's happened since Wednesday. The South Korean government sent a top official to Washington to arrange the repatriation of these South Korean workers back to South Korea. And as of Wednesday, they still were not able to fly these people out. It was some type of bureaucratic hang-up with the Trump administration. So you see how the ideology of the far right is interfering with their own economic program. The South Korean government had agreed to invest billions of dollars in the United States in exchange for lower rates of tariffs on the part of the Trump administration. But the racism is interfering with their own supposed economic objectives. And this is the same situation that developed with India. he's imposed a 50% tariff on Indian products, supposedly excluding pharmaceutical products. And that is because India purchases an enormous amount of petroleum from the Russian Federation. So the policy is so confusing and so contradictory. You have their racism, but at the same time, they want to break away the Russian Federation from BRICS, from China, but it doesn't appear as if that strategy is going anywhere.
Well,
And in Africa itself, the fact that Rwanda, Uganda, South Sudan, and Eswatini, it was announced they were willing to take in migrants from the United States. There's a lot of protest against it, even within those countries, among opposition forces and even forces within the dominant political elites in those countries. For example, there were 5 people that were sent to Eswatini, and who knows? One person, it was either Eswatini or South Sudan, was from Mexico, and they said they wanted to return to Mexico. The Mexican government said, yeah, we'll take them back, and they've left. There's others from Cuba, Vietnam, and I believe Laos, a few others. But it really doesn't amount to a whole lot. And this peace agreement between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda is a non-factor. There's still, the fighting actually has intensified in North and South Kivu, also in the area around Beni, where the Allied Democratic Forces have been active. And then once these so-called peace agreements and treaties collapse, you don't even hear about it in the news. Trump moves on to something else, like backing Israeli Air Force attack in Qatar, where the U.S. Central Command, the Pentagon, is based.
I'm glad you mentioned Israel. I wasn't going to mention Israel, but since we're talking about the whole the grotesque, xenophobia when it comes to anybody who's darker than you, browner than me.
Yes.
Both Israel and the U.S. and its allies keep trying to get African countries to say, can you take all of these people of Gaza that we're genociding right now? And a lot of African countries, even right-wing, far-right ones who are part of the same club that the Likud party is in, are saying, no, we do not want to take these refugees in. Give Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem at least a statehood, some kind of Palestinian statehood. We're not even asking for the democratic, secular one-state solution, and it's just disturbing to see how Israel and its Western backers are keep trying to say, here, African country, you name it. It could be Eritrea, it could be Somalia, it could be it could be Sudan or elsewhere. Take these, yeah, sickening. It's just
it is, and what we see happening is the discombobulation of U.S. and Western imperialists, domestic as well as foreign policy. The economies are going to be reeling from the imposition of Trump's tariffs regime. We already see the data coming in right now in the United States. African-American unemployment is skyrocketing. It's reported that 300,000 African-American women have lost their jobs just since January, after Trump came in. So no, they know, even in Egypt, for example, which borders Gaza,
under a far right military junta, which still is continuing neoliberalism. Yeah.
Yes, and they signed the Camp David Accords way back in 1979. We're talking about 46 years ago, and they know if 2.3 million Palestinians are forced into Egypt, that they're not the Palestinians are not going to sit there. They're going to organize, and they're going to send units back into occupied Palestine to resist the Zionist occupation. That means they're going to be subjected to aerial strikes and even ground interventions by the Israeli Defense Forces. And the same thing would be true in other parts of Africa. If they take in people from Palestine, they'll wind up being bombed by the Israeli Air Force and also possibly the United States Pentagon, which really facilitates, arms, and coordinates the Israeli Defense Forces. They were forewarned, and foretold that there would be a bombing of the city of Doha in Qatar to try to wipe out the top leadership of the Hamas resistance organization. And this is right at the center of their own military apparatus in West Asia. So it just shows the contradictions that we're dealing with right now on the international scene. But in Cote d'Ivoire, it would be very interesting to follow what's going to be happening over the next few weeks, with demonstrations taking place inside the country, with political parties being banned. And we know the outcome will, in all likelihood, result in a fourth term for President Alassane Ouattara. And even if he is installed for a fourth term at 80 years old, we don't know what the domestic outcome of that is going to be. It could create even more problems and possibly even a military intervention to topple his regime.
Very briefly, what can you tell us about Ivory Coast and BRICS? Any historical relations with some in BRICS that are continuing and will continue to be good, depending on if Western imperialism sabotages it? But very briefly on that one before I get to the big question about the left in Ivory Coast.
Yes, well, I doubt very seriously that France or the United States will allow Cote d'Ivoire to even open up discussions with the BRICS summit because they want to keep them clearly in the Western camp, particularly right now where you have countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, which have broken with ECOWAS and are saying that they want to break out on an independent path of development. They have Russian advisors and Russian intelligence personnel trying to maintain their authority in these three states because they have a lot of security problems with the right-wing so-called Islamist jihadist organizations like the JNIM, which are allied with Al-Qaeda. So yes, the US and the Western imperialists fund these groups to cause disruption and death and displacement in any country, even those that they're allied, even those that the imperialists allied with, in order to provide a rationale for their continued presence through the US Africa Command and also the French Foreign Legions and other NATO allied military forces in that region of West Africa.
Final question. Well, you've already answered this question, but let me ask it anyways. Does Ivory Coast currently have a strong left-wing movement, and any final thoughts you want to share about Ivory Coast and how, if the nation really wanted to overcome major poverty and certainly eradicate it, it really is only African socialism, Pan-Africanist socialism / Marxism, or barbarism, and that is the endless misery that is austerity.
Yes, the left is suppressed deliberately in Ivory Coast. Even the Popular Front, which is left social democratic party, which was founded by Laurent Gbagbo, has been suppressed to the extent of utilizing armed French paratroopers to storm his residence, to arrest him and his former wife, put his former wife in prison for a number of years, and then sent him to the International Criminal Court, which failed as well. And there was some question about sending Simone Gbagbo to the ICC. I did an interview several years ago with TVC Nigeria on the Ivory Coast question. This was while Laurent Gbagbo was still being held in the Netherlands. And I said during the interview that the Netherlands have no right to serve as a center for international legal jurisprudence based upon its own history. They were involved in the Atlantic slave trade. The Dutch East India Company, the Dutch Africa Company plundered the continent for 2 centuries. So, what right do they have to be sitting in judgment of any African leader or even African rebel leaders? And the following day, interestingly enough, the Ivorian government came out and said they had no intentions of sending any more people to the ICC, and that they would resolve all their internal problems within Ivory Coast itself. So I think they're very vulnerable on this question because the ICC is not popular across the African continent, even among countries that are conservative, moderate, and even right wing. So it's a threat to Africa and its collective well being.
Fascinating. Well, fascinating. Well, we were joined on this whole thing. Well, we have to end it there. Well, we were joined on this All Things Africa edition, learning about the history and current affairs of Ivory Coast with our always wonderful returning champion, historian, journalist, Pan-Africanist, leftist, and all-around anti-imperialist and supporter of all people power movements, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. Check out his work and all of his appearances on 1+1. Subscribe to Pan-African Newswire and Bar. Donate generously to them, and don't forget to do the same for 1+1 and donate to us, please, and share widely all of 1+1's content and encourage others to like and again share and donate, especially with Facebook, which often suppresses my ability to share. The next country we'll be exploring is Guinea. Join us next week for that, and until then, folks, have a great weekend. Good night and good luck, Abayomi. This was fascinating to listen to, and looking forward to next week. And yeah, all my best until then.